So today I'm just going to be talking about offshore wind farm and some of the development around offshore wind farm in the Quaternary. That's how you pronounce it, Quaternary. So as I go through the talk, the title start making a bit more sense. So this picture here is the Hornsea wind farm under construction. So this is at the stage where they start putting the turbines up. But before you get to that stage, there's a lot of steps that need to go through before we get to the kind of construction phase. So that's what I'm kind of going to try and guide you through today a small bit to kind of give you an overview of the things that we consider when we start to build these kinds of installations. So in the talk today, I'm going to give a bit of my own background because I realized that part of this week is really getting to know people, and if you have an interest in some of the topics I'm going to be discussing, you can come and chat to me about it. I'll give a context around offshore wind, so what are the kind of current trends and challenges. I'll bring you through some of the kind of information that we gather in order to inform where we pick these sites and how we develop them. I'll give a case study then of one offshore wind farm that didn't work and one of the reasons why it didn't. And then I'll kind of finish with some of the kind of outstanding issues that are in the field at the moment. So some of the things that going forward as researchers we need to consider for some of these installations. So my own background, so I graduated with a BSc, a Bachelor of Science in Geology from University College Cork, and then shortly afterwards I started my PhD there. I spent a year in Germany working at MAREM, the Institute for Marine Research in Bremen. And then when I finished my PhD, I went to work for a company called Geolectric, which was an Irish renewable energy developer, so that's me. There is a much younger, fresh-faced PhD graduate. And in that company, I worked on two main projects. I worked on what is now the North Irish Sea Array. So this is a wind farm in the Irish Sea, which has currently got a contract and will be constructed within the next couple of years. But I also worked on a project for compressed air energy storage, so looking at storing air underground in salt caverns as a sort of a battery, effectively. So I worked for them for a couple of years, and then the allure of research was a bit too much. So I went back to ICRAG, so the SFI Centre for Research and Applied Geosciences, where I was a postdoc for a couple of years. And then last year, or 2 years ago, I took up a lectureship position in UCD School of Earth Sciences, which is where I am now. So in the last couple of years then, I've kind of stayed in touch with the industry, so I do some consulting with a company based here in Dublin called Gavin and Darday Geosolutions, who work on a lot of offshore wind projects, both in Ireland, the UK, America, and the rest of Europe. But I've also kind of supported the government in its development of its offshore plans. So I sat on the Technical Advisory Committee to the government for what we call the Offshore Renewable Energy Development Plan 2, or REDP2, which is Ireland's strategy for building out wind farms over the next kind of 30 years, basically. So I kind of fed a lot of my research and expertise into some of the planning around that. Generally, my research interest is in the seabed. So I'm really interested in basically how the seabed has evolved over time and how we use it for kind of sustainable practices in terms of developing offshore wind and various environmental issues. So parts of my PhD work was looking at how former ice sheets, so how glaciation has affected the seabed, and then using that information to see where are the best places or not to build offshore wind. So that was a lot of kind of my PhD and postdoc work. When I was doing that, one of the issues that kind of came up is that once we put the installations on the seabed, the interaction between the seabed and these structures in terms of how the seabed moves around and evolves is a bit of an engineering consideration. So I look a lot as well at in terms of sediment mobility, how the seabed moves around. And I have a PhD student, there's a PhD student working with me on this at the moment, Miriam Walsh. When I was doing some of this work as well, we were looking at shipwrecks as like natural laboratories for testing some of the theories we had around structure-seabed interaction. So I do a lot of work mapping shipwrecks, both in terms of natural laboratories, as I said, but also shipwrecks as pollution potential. So a lot of these wrecks carry very nasty chemicals, and if the area around the seabed, if the seabed around these starts to collapse, you know, the shipwreck starts to collapse, starts releasing pollutants. So there's a project I'm involved in Cork looking at that. And I'm also interested then as well in terms of how much carbon the seabed can store. So I'm leading or co-leading a project on that, which Phoebe is also working on, where we're looking at how different sediment types store different amount of carbon, and then how human impacts can potentially release this carbon back into the atmosphere. So that's generally sort of my research interest. As you can see, it's kind of quite broad. But generally speaking, what it involves is layering lots of kind of different marine data types together to develop these sort of ground models to understand how the seabed has evolved, and at present how the seabed is kind of reacting to different processes. So this often involves a lot of cross-disciplinary research. So I work a lot with marine surveyors and oceanographers. I work a lot with geophysicists. I work with geotechnical engineers, geoscientists, numerical modelers, and marine scientists. So the area of kind of marine geoscience, marine science is huge, and it really involves all these different expertise. And then more recently then, communicating my science and communicating the research that I'm involved in is becoming increasingly important to me, in terms of not only feeding it to policy, but also getting it out into everyday people and getting them to understand the need to look at the seabed and understand the seabed. So as Thomas alluded to yesterday, I work quite closely with himself and with Hircha and Josephine, who's here as well, in terms of looking at public perceptions and understanding around the seabed and different processes. And I also work a lot with writers and artists in terms of communicating our science through writing, through art exhibitions. So I've worked on a couple of projects around that as well. So moving on then to what I actually do rather than doing art and writing. So this is Hornsea. It's the largest offshore wind farm in the world at present. It's off the UK coast, and it's about 460 square kilometers. So just to put that in context, that's about 1.5 times the size of Dublin city area. So this is quite a large area, as you can imagine. So spatially, we're taking up a lot of seabed, and that creates a kind of a couple of challenges in terms of you're looking at how the seabed changes over a large area, but you're also looking at who else is using this kind of size area of marine space, or who else is looking to operate in these kind of areas. So there are kind of a number of technical and I suppose social challenges to offshore wind at the moment. So this is just a kind of a summary slide for some of those. So we have to consider the environment in terms of like what are the best sites, if they are the best sites technically, environmentally, how do we consider putting turbines into these areas? What other users of this marine space do we have to consider in terms of fisheries, in terms of transport, in terms of tourism, etc. Sometimes when we have the best sites that have the best wind resource and the best seabed for developing, it doesn't really matter because we're too far away from the grid. So we have to build a wire that brings the electricity back to shore and plugs into our electricity system. But if the grid infrastructure is poor, then it's not a great place to build it. And then finally, what do we do at the end of the project? So like a lot of these wind farms are 20, 30-year lifespans. So what happens at the end? How do we decommission these? What do we do with all the materials that are left over in terms of the turbine blades, in terms of all the rare earths that we heard about yesterday that go into some of these things? So these are some of the things that we consider and some of the technical challenges that are out there at the moment. In terms of the technology then, of building these kind of structures, it's pretty well known because we've adopted a lot of the practices, a lot of the technologies from oil and gas. So oil and gas for decades has been building these large structures, offshore oil rigs, etc. So essentially we've adopted a lot of that technology. So here's just a kind of an image showing the different foundation types that we can deploy, and you kind of pick your preferred foundation based on the type of seabed that you're encountering, so what kind of sediments are at the seabed, but also in terms of your water depth. So anywhere up to kind of 60 meters or thereabout, you're kind of looking at a gravity foundation, which is basically just a heavy weight that holds the turbine to the seabed. We've got a monopile, which is effectively a large pole that we drive into the seabed and then put the wind turbine on top. And this is the most popular solution. So about 90% of projects will use a monopile because the technology is so well understood and it's so simple to do. This is a suction casing, so it's basically a bucket that's overturned. You vacuum out a lot of water, it creates a vacuum, and then it drives itself into the seabed that way, and then acts as an anchor as a result of the sediment that gets brought into the bucket. Once we start going deeper, between kind of 60 and maybe 80 meters, you're starting looking at kind of jacket structures with various different piling solutions. You're using much more material here, so it's going to be much more expensive. And then finally, from kind of 80 meters water depth beyond, we're looking at these floating structures. So we're not fixing the foundation directly to the seabed. The structure is basically floating in the water column, and it's tethered to the seabed using a series of lines and wires and moorings and stuff like that. So again, we're using different materials here because we have these kind of mooring lines, which are synthetic ropes and chains. So we're using different types of materials. Our anchor solutions are different, so we're using things like drag embedment anchors. So the technology varies, but it is quite well understood. And so we can basically pick an engineering solution for most water depths, most types of seabeds that we can encounter. So we can engineer out most kind of seabed conditions. In terms of where and to what scale this technology is being kind of deployed and the trends across Europe, offshore wind is getting a lot of traction in terms of an attractive technology to deploy, mainly because of what we call the capacity factor. So obviously it's a much greener less carbon emission producer than, say, coal and gas. But one of the reasons why renewable energy kind of suffers in the face of some of these fossil fuel based generation is what we call the capacity factor. So the capacity factor is how much of the time are you producing your maximum output of energy from any of these technologies. And because with coal and gas it's combustion based, it's very easy to control. So you can get capacity factors of maybe 60 to 70%, which means that as the technology is running, up to 70% of the time you're producing your maximum output, whereas for something like solar or onshore wind, it's much less because the wind, the sun is more intermittent and the technology is less evolved. But for offshore wind, the best turbines on the market at the moment have a 63% capacity factor. So they're slowly creeping up on some of these other technologies, and not to mention the fact that there's much less carbon emissions, obviously. So across Europe then, there's been a huge drive. I'm kind of just focusing on Europe because that's where most of the activity is happening. Obviously, offshore wind farms being developed across the world. But just focusing in on Europe, there's been a huge drive across many of the countries to develop these. I'm going to throw a few numbers at you, but just to kind of put it in context, I'm talking about gigawatts here. So 1 gigawatt is about 1,000 megawatts, and then 1 megawatt is enough to power about 750 residential homes. So just to give you an idea of scale here. So these countries here are the ones that are developing the most amount of offshore wind. So the UK, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark and Belgium are really kind of leading the way. But also we've seen development of offshore wind in Poland, France as well, and many other countries have plans afoot to develop, but these are really the kind of leaders in terms of the fixed foundations. So these are the ones that are attached to the seabed or are fixed to the seabed, as I mentioned. In terms of floating wind then, the likes of Norway, France and Portugal have all developed wind farm projects to varying degrees, either as demonstration projects or small-scale commercial projects. And the reason why these countries are doing it is because of the water conditions or the seabed or the water depths off of their coast. So as you move further west, the shelf drops off quite dramatically, so you get much deeper water conditions in some of these countries, so floating is preferred for them. So in total then, there's about 34 gigawatts of offshore wind deployed at present across Europe, but that only makes up about 4% of the power mix for the whole of Europe. So obviously individually in each of these countries it can make up a much higher proportion, but I just put this up to show that despite the huge amount of development that's happened, there's no silver bullet answer to how we decarbonize our energy sector. So it's not just going to be offshore wind that's going to answer a lot of these challenges. We have to do it in tandem with other technologies as well. So just in terms of some of the trends that are happening, or some of the factors that are driving offshore wind at the moment, here's a summary of a report from 2017 in terms of what's really kind of pushing offshore wind. The main driver being market scale and visibility. So basically, this is at a policy level. What are the European Union and what are the individual countries saying are their targets in terms of how much wind they want to develop? There's the enablers. There's the enablers then. So in terms of like, okay, you want to build offshore wind, but how are you doing it? Are you Are you identifying sites? Are you building out your grid? Are you providing incentive mechanisms? So how do you get paid for all that energy? And then there's supporting stuff then in terms of like, is your supply chain there? Can you build some of this stuff in your own country, lessening costs? And innovation, can you produce new technologies that help lower the cost? So there's a lot there, but primarily the main kind of things that the main enablers or the key aspects here are site development. So making sure we pick the best sites that are easy to build on, that have the best wind resource, and then providing a financial mechanism that pays for the energy in a sort of a competitive way, which allows, say, offshore wind to compete with the likes of coal-burning plants with oil-burning plants. So I'm just going to kind of delve a small bit more. I don't know much about this, but I can delve a lot into the site development side of it. So that's what I'm going to talk about now later on. But just to highlight as well that there's been a kind of a move in Europe in particular from what we call a developer-led model to a plan-led model. So originally, a lot of offshore wind development would have just been companies going out to deciding, I want this piece of seabed, I want to build there. But then there's a lot of high costs associated with that. There was a lot of uncertainty. So a lot of governments, mainly the UK, Germany, and Netherlands in particular, took the idea that, okay, we're actually going to do a lot of the development for you. So this will help de-risk the projects. It was showing the market that governments were backing offshore wind. So in terms of financing, it made it much easier. So to different degrees, different countries provide information or support developers at different stages of the project, from kind of site identification right through to the kind of grid aspect. So you can have a kind of a highly centralized system like they have in the Netherlands, where basically the Dutch government and its supporting bodies like TNO and RVO do all of this work and hand over to the developer at the very end. Or in the UK, where basically the Crown Estate identifies the main areas they want to build and then lets the developers bid on that and then do the rest, basically. And the effect that this had is had a huge impact in terms of cost reduction. So these are just some of the cost, the price trends across Europe. And I think the main thing to see is just that from kind of the mid-2000s up to more recently, across the board, there's been a reduction in price. And this is mainly because governments are providing a lot of that information that's de-risking sites, and it's incentivizing and allowing finance to be developed, or finance to be released for these kind of projects. So just to kind of bring it back to where I'm comfortable and what I'm really interested in is in terms of like looking at the seabed, understanding the seabed, and then using that information to help kind of build and de-risk these kind of projects. So this is Scrooby Sands. It's off the east coast of the UK. Very interesting project in the sense that you've got these stunning kind of sandbanks in the area. So you know, here's a kind of a dried out area basically. On high tide, this actually floods and is then underwater. So, you know, your interaction between met-ocean conditions and the seabed, you know, has a really kind of strong control or determination on how you build these projects. And you can kind of see then, like in the wake of this structure, there's a lot of kind of turbulence and eddies, which is interacting with the turbines, and probably at the seabed in these different locations, there's different processes going on. So understanding all these together is what kind of I'm really interested in. And just to bring it back then to the kind of title of my talk, Building Offshore Wind Farms in the Quaternary. As geologists, as geoscientists, we try to make sense of the whirling wind of time, that is geological time, by compartmentalizing it into different kind of periods. So we break it up into time chunks. And the time that we're kind of currently in is the Quaternary, which is kind of like this last 2.6 million years of Earth history. And it's had a huge impact on the seabed in particular, primarily because of glaciation. And this is mostly in northern Europe and high latitudes. So as the video is kind of playing through, we're moving through geological time here up until about 11,000 years ago. So we'll jump back there now in a moment. Yeah, so 25,000 years ago, most of the UK and Ireland and northern Europe was covered in ice. So we were talking maybe up to 2 to 4 kilometer thick of ice moving down across these countries. And as it's doing that, it's changing the environment, it's changing the seabed, When we get ice over sediment, if you have, say, 2 kilometers of ice, you're compressing that sediment, you're squeezing out all the water, so you're making the seabed much more indurated, much harder. When the ice retreats then as well, you get a lot of melting water, releasing a lot of different materials, different sediment types, you get gravels. So basically, glaciations, they have a strong modifying effect on our landscape and on our seabed. So kind of understanding where ice has been and the different processes and the implications in terms of what does that mean for seabed structure is really important if we're going to be driving piles down into these various different layers of the seabed. So then this is a kind of a schematic showing the kind of the different types of seabed vertically that we can encounter. So we can get bedrock, which is very hard rock. It's very hard to pile through that. So typically what we want to find is areas where we get some sediment cover. But then some of this sediment, as I mentioned, might be full of cobbles, might be full of boulders, which is very hard to pile through. If it's been covered in ice, it's probably been compacted and indurated. So that means it's also very, very hard. So we're kind of looking across and trying to understand not only the kind of the horizontal variability, but also the vertical variability in the seabed, and the kind of challenges that can throw up. So when it comes to kind of picking sites and developing sites, just in terms of the kind of project development timeline, typically how you start is with a desktop study. So you gather together all the available information that you can find online or through various different data repositories. A lot of countries have their own seabed mapping program, so they can provide free information about the seabed that you can start with. And you can use this information then to do your constraint mapping. So you can pick out the areas where you definitely don't want to go. And this could be because of the seabed, but it could also be kind of things like, is it a fished area? Is it in the middle of a say, a travel route for shipping or whatever? So you can kind of start breaking down your area and say like, okay, here's not so good, etc. And based on that, then you plan environmental surveys. So you probably spend about a year, 2 years doing your desktop study. Once you have that, then you go out on a boat, which is my favorite part, and you start gathering all the information on the seabed. And this can often take maybe 3 to 5 years to do that. You're gathering a lot of information, time-lapse information, so over different timescales. And the data that you gather as part of this, you're feeding into not only looking at how you will build your offshore wind farm, and also the resource, which determines how much energy you're going to produce, but you're also looking at information that's feeding into your environmental impact assessment. So basically, if we build a wind farm in this area, what are the habitats there? How might this construction impact on those various different habitats, fisheries, etc.? So that all goes into this kind of phase of the project here. Once you have your environmental impact assessment completed, you typically get what we call a CFD offer, so a contract for difference offer. So this is the government offering you a contract to produce electricity. So you tell them, okay, we've done our EIA, we think this area has got good wind speeds, we can produce this amount of electricity, it's not going to impact on the environment, what do you think? And if they agree with you, they say, yeah, good job, here's a contract, so you can build a wind farm, and for 20 years, if you produce this amount of electricity, you'll get this amount of money. So at that stage, once you have a CFD offer, then you start moving to your kind of what we call front-end engineering design. So this is really the more detailed engineering work in terms of like what types of foundations you're going to use, how big are they, how much materials are going into them, your cable routes, that kind of thing. So the more nitty-gritty engineering stage. And once you've done that, you go to the market, you get money from some financial institution like Green Giraffe or one of the banking sector entities, and you go out and you build your wind farm. All the while then, most importantly, is you're engaging with stakeholders at different steps of this process, be it local fishermen when you're going to do your survey work, making sure that you don't impact on what they do, up until the construction stage where you may be engaging with ports and harbours and how you can use them and what impact this is going to have on their operations. So at the data collection stage, which I said is kind of my favorite bit, we can go out to sea for weeks at a time on vessels like this. So this is the state scientific vessel, the RV Celtic Explorer. And we basically initially use sound, different forms of sound to map the seabed. So what's happening here is that underneath the boat, there's a small kind of sensor, which is sending out a pulse of sound, and it's recording the time it takes for that sound to go down, return up to the boat, and it's turning that travel time into a map of the seabed. So we turn time into distance because we know the speed of sound through water, and we can create these maps, these kind of topography, or what we say in marine terms, bathymetry maps of the seabed, so we can see how the structure of the seabed changes. So that's effectively what kind of multi-beam is. But when we fine-tune the sound source, we can look at the seabed in different ways. So we can not only look at what's at the seabed, how the seabed structure changes, but we can also look below the seabed. We can see what different layers are below the seabed, and we can also look at what's at the seabed. So we can use things like side-scan sonar to map things like shipwrecks. Boulders are a big concern, or cables or something like that. So we're looking at the structure of the seabed, what's on the seabed, and what's below the seabed. And once we have a map like that then, so with these maps, it's all based on sound effectively, so we have an idea of what's there, but we don't actually know for certain. So then we have to go back out on a second survey with equipment like this, which we use to probe or sample the seabed. So we take physical samples of the seabed, bring it back to the lab, and analyze it for various different engineering parameters. We can take samples which look at kind of the bentos, so we look at the marine benthic communities and so forth. So typically a survey will comprise your initial geophysical stage and then what we call your ground truthing or geotechnical phase. So there are two kind of distinct phases using different machines, different vessel types, etc. And once we have all that information, then we can compile it all into what we call a ground model. So we basically layer all this information together. We apply some of our geological understanding in terms of was the area covered in ice and what kind of geological history it had. And we build up this this model which allows us to understand the structure of the seabed, what types of sediment are there, et cetera. And we can use this then to kind of manage the risk of the project in terms of we know what the seabed structure is like, therefore we can start making informed decisions on our engineering, what happens next. However, not all risk is geological, so I have a small video here just that I'm going to play. So excuse the sound in a minute. What?
Understood, sir. Thank you.
So, does anybody know what that is? Pardon? Pardon? Blue whale. No, I wish. So that's what we call UXO. So it's unexploded ordnance. So all across the seabed, there's bombs. There's like old landmines, sea mines from the First and Second World War. So really part of the risk is trying to find where these things are, because you really don't want to put a turbine on top of one of those. So effectively. Another thing that we have to consider then, as I mentioned, is when we put these structures into the seabed, how the seabed will react. So here we have various different layers, but quite often this upper layer of the seabed is mobile. So if we put in the wind turbines like this, the seabed can, and we put in, say, like cables associated with it, the seabed can often move because the ocean drives it. We can bury the cables. We can lower the sediment around the turbines, making them unstable. So quite often then we have to put in kind of engineering work, so we can put in rock armor along these to kind of protect it and prevent the changes in the seabed from affecting the turbine stability. And quite often when we do that, they create kind of little sanctuaries for life as well, so we can get like fish nurseries developing around this. So it's quite often the engineering solutions that you can deliver can be nature-based, if that makes sense. So you can do it in a way that kind of promotes marine biodiversity and offers sanctuary for marine life as well. So just then to kind of give you a case study. So everything I've talked about is kind of theoretical in a way. So I just want to kind of ground it in a case study for the next minute or two of a project that didn't come to fruition. So back in the early 2000s, the UK government identified this area off the north coast of Wales and south of the Isle of Man, called the Celtic Array, as a potential site for development. The main thing they based it on was that it had good water depth. As far as they could tell, the ground conditions were good. There was no shipping routes, and all the stakeholders in the area were quite in favour of it. And also there was a really good grid connection here on Anglesey. So if they built the cable, brought it onshore, the energy could flow. But when they got out there and they started doing more detailed mapping of the area, here's a map of the site. So if you're not used to bathymetry, it might be hard, but basically the different colours represent different water depths. So you can see where it's lighter, it's about 28 meters, where it's darker, it's about 90 meters. But I think the main thing you can pick out, you've got all these little features. So we've got these sediment waves here, we've got these kind of large blobs that form kind of highs in the area, and there's a lot of these kind of long linear features. So a very diverse seabed. So something has been happening here over geological time which has really affected the structure of the seabed. And when they went out and they did some more mapping and they looked below the surface using some of those techniques that I mentioned, and they tied it in with their geological understanding of the area, basically the area had been heavily influenced by ice. So there had been repeated advances and retreats of ice over this area over the last kind of 25,000 years at all, creating a whole range of different glacial features which are very difficult to engineer into because they typically are full of gravel, they're full of boulders, they're full of very hard substrates. It also created a variable rockhead, so we get different covering of sediment. So basically the site was really variable, very challenging, and in the end the project had to be cancelled because it was just far too challenging from a kind of a geological standpoint. So that aside, generally speaking, as I said, we can engineer out most solutions when it comes to development of offshore wind. So once we understand the seabed, we can make really good engineering informed decisions on what types of foundations we're going to build. But as we kind of move forward in terms of developing offshore wind, and we move away from what we call the low-hanging fruit sites, so the very easy sites to develop, and we start moving into deeper waters, moving into other areas, as I mentioned, like the expansion of offshore wind is taking up a huge spatial array. We start encountering, other problems that are maybe not necessarily engineering related. So one of these things is looking at the interaction between marine habitats and offshore wind. So as I mentioned, in many instances, by putting in a wind turbine, you can kind of create an artificial environment which could promote biodiversity, promote species development and so forth. But again, the science around it still isn't very certain, especially if you're moving from different, say, oceanographic regimes. It's not going to be the same everywhere. So there's quite a lot of work that needs to go into this at this stage. As well, when we start putting some of these structures into the water column, the fact that we've got these obstacles in the water column can create changes in the ocean dynamics. So like when you think of waves and currents moving across the ocean, if you've got these structures in the way, it's creating turbulence, it's changing the oceanographic dynamics. And again, if you've got offshore wind deployed at scale, are all these structures interaction with each other, and are they changing basically the ocean dynamics, which can have an impact on primary bioactivity in terms of nutrient flux, in terms of chlorophyll enhancement, and that has an impact then in terms of fisheries, in terms of seabirds. So there's this kind of knock-on effect. So here's a satellite image from an offshore wind farm in the UK. You can see each kind of dot is an individual turbine, and all this kind of, the blue is obviously the ocean, and then all this kind of darker, sandier is basically turbulence generating sediment plumes in the water column. So, over the lifespan of 20 or 30 years, how much of an impact is this going to have on the local environment is a big consideration. In turn, then, this has an impact on an area of research that I'm interested in terms of carbon sequestration. So, arguably, I won't get into the details of it, but when we disturb the seabed, we potentially release carbon back into the atmosphere. There's an argument that if we put wind farms in these areas, there's a very short disturbance time, and then by having the wind farms in these areas, no other activity can happen, so you don't get fishing happening. So as a result, do they promote the sequestration of carbon in the seabed? Again, there's not enough known about that, so that's something we're kind of currently working on in UCD. The other thing is, with all this work that's happening in the ocean, we're producing a lot of noise. So we're surveying using acoustic methods, we're putting noise into the environment. Is this having an impact on marine mammals, for example, who have auditory, sensory problems? So when we survey, we're creating noise. When the turbines are operating, they're creating noise through vibration, and then when we decommission them, it's all creating noise. The question is this because it's the time frames versus, say, like fishing or boating activity, is it on the same level? Again, there's more work that needs to be done around that. And then finally, then there's that kind of shared space question. If we're putting up these turbines in certain areas that are kind of where fishing has happened, what's the kind of offset there in terms of economics for one, but also culturally as well? If we're displacing fisheries, where are they going to go, and what's the impact that that's going to have? So kind of creating this shared marine space as well is very important, and that's where the kind of work that I do with Thomas and Hirsch and Josie is kind of important as well, is understanding, you know, fisheries in particular, what's their attachment to an area? Is it purely economical, or is it something a bit more social in the sense that for generations we've been fishing here? Fishing is in a good place in Ireland at the moment, but it's all we've ever done, so we're not going to abandon that now. So there's all these kind of other topics outside of the engineering that we need to consider. So just to conclude then, I suppose offshore wind is technically very, very feasible and at scale, but the one thing that we're kind of constantly having to revisit and look into is some of these more kind of environmental impacts in terms of habitats, in terms of noise, in terms of marine use. And then something that I didn't necessarily touch on, but that was alluded to yesterday, like if we're producing a whole lot of electricity, you know, do we have the grid to support it? Do we need batteries and stuff like that to store it as well? So yeah, I'm here all week, and if you have any questions today, I'm very happy to take them.